Good evening, everyone. My name's Merope Mills. I'm partner and editor at Tortoise. Welcome to Tortoise and welcome to our digital newsroom, a place where we come together to discuss important ideas of the moment and ask important questions in the form of a think-in. I'm sure loads of you have been to one before and already know what a think-in is, but for those of you who haven't, a think-in is a system of organised listening. It's loosely based on a news organisation news conference of the type that I used to have at The Guardian, and my colleagues had at the BBC and the Times before, where we worked before Tortoise. And it's not a panel event, even though we have some brilliant guests with us today. The idea is to hear from other people in the digital room. So we do want to hear from you. You have been automatically muted when you come on the call, but don't take it personally. That's just so we don't hear your background noise, but we do want you to get involved. And there are two ways you can do that. The first is to raise your blue digital hand, which you can do by hovering over the screen, clicking on participants at the bottom there, and a little list of names comes up, and at the bottom there's a button which says raise your hand. If you click that, if you want to have a go now and a little practice, a little blue digital hand will come up and I will know that you are ready to speak and can come to you. And the second way you can get involved is to talk in our chat, where my colleague Liz, give us a wave, Liz, is ready to talk to you if you're feeling too shy to talk and would rather type. So please do get stuck in there. The question we are asking tonight is, post-COVID, what can't we afford to treat anymore? And before we get started, I should thank our partners at Aurora, who've been exploring the need for greater collaboration in healthcare since before coronavirus took hold. So thanks to them, and thanks to our three great guests who have joined us tonight, who I will introduce now. They are David Nicholson, the former Chief Executive of NHS England and the current Chair of the Worcestershire Acute Hospitals NHS Trust. Richard Talbot, the Chief Executive of the ABPI, the Association of British Pharmaceuticals Industry, and Dame Donna, Kinnair, the Royal College of Nursing Chief Executive and General Secretary. So thank you all for taking the time to join us. Before I go to you guys, though, I would like to go to my colleague, Chris Cook, who is a former policy editor at Newsnight, who wrote a piece for us back in March about the NHS being at capacity, and is going to talk to a few handy slides that you should be able to see on the screen now if everything goes smoothly.
So,
thank you. It did go smoothly.
Chris, hello. The thing I would start off by saying, actually, before we went to the slides, would be that there are sort of 3 or 4 things about this question about what we can afford, which some of which aren't amenable to slides. Like the first thing is we can afford for as much as we're willing to pay, right? So all of these things everything is a political choice. So the idea of things being unaffordable is always bracketed with it's unaffordable if I'm unwilling to raise enough money to do it, right? The second thing is that there is not going to be an answer at the end of all of this, which is if we just stop doing IVF, or if we just stop doing dealing with fat people, right? There's not going to be a nice, elegant through line that balances the budget without. Even if even if you think those were things that are acceptable, that gets you out of this. And then the political context, which was the thing I was going to go to with the slides, are that we have the NHS is in a quite strange place. So this is a chart that shows, if you like, the capital value of the National Health Service in England. So it is effectively how much it would have cost in each of those years to replace the entire stock of the whole NHS. And it's a weird, strange, hypothetical number. But the thing you'll notice about it is that, it starts indexed at 100. So what you can see is sort of how the capital value has changed since 2000 for all of these, for basically the whole of Europe. And what you can see is that everyone is investing in their hospitals over the last 20 years. So they're buying new kit, they're building new buildings, and the cost, if you like, of replacing the whole German healthcare system in 2020 is much, much more than the cost of replacing the English health system in 2000, right? Ours is quite weird for the fact that we haven't invested very much at all in the basic capital stock. We've done what we can to get by. We've done a lot of selling off of capital stock to pay for so we sell off land near hospitals to pay for improvements inside the hospitals. But it means that the whole system basically hasn't expanded in value. And it's a sort of rough metric, but it's a way of illustrating the fact that we haven't built out the capacity of the NHS over the last few years. If we go to the next slide, you can see the consequences of that. So these little graphs show the for each year, they run from July to June. For each year, show how many people are being treated within 4 hours in an NHS and an English accident emergency. And you can see there's a sort of V-shaped pattern every year. So the middle of the graph in each of these graphs is winter, and you can see things decline into winter and they recover normally into the summer months. And what is happening since 2010-11 is you can see drifting further and further and further from target. It's basically around 2015-16, we have a winter and we kind of never get it back. Things just carry on getting worse and worse and worse. And that doesn't reflect the fact that the health service is doing less. It reflects the fact that we get more and more patients turning up every single week, every single month, every single year to hospitals. And you have to build out the capacity of the health service to keep up. We're treating more and more patients in under 4 hours, as it happens. There are just more and more patients turning up, at a faster rate. So there are more people turning up who aren't treated in under 4 hours, if that makes sense. Anyway, I think that's the big picture, really, is we're running kind of on empty. And we haven't done the building out of the capacity over the last 20 years, which really, to keep up with population dynamics of an aging economy, we probably should have done.
Thank you, Chris. I know you love a graph and love a chance to talk about them. So thank you for introducing us like that. I'm going to come to you now, David. We've stood clapping for the NHS for months on end, and the appreciation for a service that's free at the point of need has never been higher. But it does seem like there is a huge worry, a huge anxiety in the air about the future of the NHS and what it should look like and the cost that we're going to need to shoulder. The question I've got to you to start with is, how worried should we be about the services that may not be available in the future? Oh, hang on, we just need to, can we hear you? Hopefully you are unmuted. Now
is it right? Is it working? Sorry, it wasn't me. It wasn't me. It wasn't me. So we should be quite worried. In fact, I vary between being quite worried and very, very worried. Partly because of what we've experienced over the last 3 or 4 months, really. Because our experience of COVID and what's happened as part of that has made the job much, much more difficult. There's no doubt in my mind, and I was originally appointed to lead the NHS in 2006, so saw the end of the Blair years of increased growth, and then lived through the first 5 years or so of austerity. And you can see absolutely, and I think the graph, all right, doesn't show it completely well, but it does show the impact of austerity on the NHS. And what's been happening underneath all of those numbers is the NHS has been going faster and faster and harder and harder. And if you think about, if I just think about my own organisation in Worcester, which is a kind of average kind of place, we regularly now run at 98, 99% occupancy. And given we know that the evidence around seems to say that 85 to 90% is probably the most efficient way to run a hospital. Any more than that, you have big infection control problems. You can see the problem we've got. Add to that the way in which capacity is now being dealt with by COVID, and you can see the problem. We think, and depending on who you talk to within the NHS, between 10 and 30% of all our capacity is basically going to be held up certainly over the next 12 months or so, and possibly further, dealing with the consequences having a coronavirus in the system. So getting back to the levels that we even wanted to before is going to be very difficult. In the environment we're finding, I think it's going to be even more difficult.
Right. You know, you mentioned your time working in the Blair years, and we spoke before, and there's something that you said that sort of stayed with me, which was that, you know, you had the conversation about how to manage an NHS which needed to be, you know, universal and free on the one hand, and with boundaries on the other hand, and you've gone back and forth about, you know, the best way to cope with that tension, and that you came up with the idea that the best path was just to muddle through, which is what you said to me. Would you just talk a bit about what you mean, and should we really be just muddling through in the time ahead?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the things we were trying to think of at the time is to kind of identify what the offer was. And if you remember, we developed in the end, we developed the NHS Constitution, which was supposed to be put some kind of shape to what the boundaries should be. But of course, the dilemma with doing it in that way is that you end up policing the boundaries. That's what the argument becomes about, rather than how do you make the whole of the service work better. And we looked at lots of options. We looked at, should we just let NICE decide exactly what was in the offer and what wasn't? Should we be more restrictive and have different offers in different parts of the country? Or should we have some kind of national convention which might decide what the offer was? In the end, the conclusion was at that stage, I'm not saying forever, but that stage was, we're better to muddle through. That actually what you're better to do is get people at a local level to do proper needs assessments of what their population requires. And then the politicians would allocate the resource, and there would obviously be national priorities that you'd have to lead, and actually most national priorities would be the local priorities. And then on any scope you had, you could use locally to look at your particular population, the particular needs that it had. And in a sense, you would then prioritize things. So you would say, we'd like to do all of these things, but we can only do these 5 this year, these 2 this next year. And that was a kind of certainly more pragmatic way of dealing with it, certainly more and a less politically controversial way of doing it than trying to set out a whole variety of things that were in and out of the offer.
And am I right in thinking at the moment that you have what you call streams of, you know, whether in future are we going to see that NHS split into sort of clean and dirty sites, or rather COVID and non-COVID streams?
Well, if you think about running hospitals, and I was the chief executive for a long time. Before that, I ran hospitals for 20 years. You know, it's quite a complicated thing running a hospital. Getting the flow of patients through it is always quite complicated. You've got a variety of specialties, you've got a number of beds, you've got operating theatres, outpatients, and you try to model the best way through. Suddenly, everything has got more complicated. Because just take at the moment, we have a green stream of patients, that are patients who are coming in the hospital that are COVID-free. We've got patients who we don't know whether they have COVID or not, so they're cohorted in another stream. We have a third stream, which are patients that we know have got COVID, and then we have a fourth stream of patients who are immunocompromised, who need absolutely completely special things. And the way we're handling it, and many hospitals and groups of hospitals are doing it, is identifying areas in the hospital, or indeed individual hospitals. So we have 3 hospitals, 2 of them have COVID patients in, 1 is completely free. And that's the way in which everyone at the moment is trying to work through how we restart, because health is no different to the rest of the economy. You know, closing down all the services that we did, we thought was a remarkable thing to enable us to do, to create the space for COVID patients to be treated. Opening up is proving to be much, much, much more difficult.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, David. I'm going to say, I can see Miranda, you've got your hand up. I'll come to you in a little bit. And a couple of interesting chats. Someone, J.A. Fox, is talking very interestingly on behalf of baby boomers. I'd love to come to you in a bit if you were willing. In the meantime, Richard, let me come to you. And actually, I'm going to say something which I think echoes something else that someone has said in the chat, Nikki Gorb, who said, is it less of a question of what we can't treat, but what we can't afford not to treat?
Well, I very much agree with the kind of sentiment behind that comment, really. I think that, you know, if we haven't had the starkest possible reminder of the consequences of not investing in prevention, investing in diagnosis, investing in enough care infrastructure to treat the needs of the population, the ramifications are really quite dramatic. And you know, if I may, I was going to come back actually to Chris's introduction, which I thought was, you know, really nicely set up this discussion, because I think in many countries, most of the developed world, of course, there's a very understandable debate about sustainability of healthcare expenditure and the affordability of healthcare expenditure. And I think for me that the difficulty with this sort of language is that it kind of implies that there is some sort of cliff edge somewhere, some sort of point at which sustainability kind of means that you can't go on and things fall off the edge of a cliff. What will happen? You know, does the economy collapse? Does, you know, we're not really clear about what we mean by sustainability. And I think, you know, the point that I would want to make about this is, I think one of the questions that I think can help us in determining whether or not it makes sense to spend more is, how confident are we about the systems and processes we've got to give us confidence that for every pound we put in, we're going to get real value back. And I guess to be blunt about it, I mean, there may be some healthcare systems in the world that are so broken and so inefficient that we know that putting more money in will go down the tubes. But there may be other examples of where, you know, you are very confident you've got a very efficient health system and you're going to get good use of resource and patient outcomes at the end of it. And the debate we need to have is, where does the NHS sit in that? I would contend that the NHS is at the more efficient end of health systems, and that's certainly what you would get from the views of people like the OECD and the European Commission and so on. But I fundamentally think that the level of expenditure we need to have, I think, a slightly more realistic debate about. And the final sort of comparison I want to draw is with the US. And, you know, just to illustrate the point, there are many things that I would say is wrong with the US healthcare system. I wouldn't want to get into debate about the detail, but all sorts of very well-known, deeply problematic equity issues with US healthcare. We spend about 10% of our GDP on health, they spend about 18%. As much as I would not want to emulate the US healthcare system, the one thing you couldn't argue is simply spending that much money has damaged the economy, because it hasn't. It's still the biggest economy in the world. It's got arguably the best healthcare innovation in the world, all sorts of problems, of course, but it's not the amount of money that has led to kind of some of those challenges. So very final thing I'll say in this is, what does having confidence that you're going to spend the money well look like? Obviously, I'm here as Chief Executive of the Pharma Industries Association, and you know, I'm very happy to, you know, talk about how that works in the UK. I think it's one example of the healthcare expenditure, of the healthcare budget, where there are very well engineered systems for scrutinising how what money gets spent is spent. We have NICE, we have other measures, and so on. And I think the more we can use evidence to inform decision making in other areas of healthcare, other areas of technology spend, the better. I'll probably
Richard, thank you very much. Briefly on that point about you representing the pharmaceuticals industry, you know, that big pharma are often the sort of bogeymen in this conversation, you know, that people would say that the reason we can't afford to treat what we already treat is because companies have us over a barrel, the drug prices are too high. Is that fair?
Well, look, you know, you wouldn't surprise me. You wouldn't surprise you to know that it's not the first time I've had to be called a bogeyman on a Zoom call. I mean, it won't surprise you to know I would say I don't think that's fair. I think it's a real shame. And you know, honestly, certainly in the current climate, you know, we have the most desperate healthcare crisis globally right now. There are 120 different vaccines being investigated around the world. Around 3/4 of those are projects led by the pharmaceutical industry. 100% of those vaccine candidates will ultimately require the pharma industry to manufacture at scale and distribute around the world. When it comes to therapeutics, there are around 400 therapeutics across over 2,000 trials around the world. So, you know, the world really is relying on the pharmaceutical industry now to step up, and it is frankly doing so in an extraordinary way. But outside of COVID, I do want to just make it really crystal clear how medicines pricing and access works in the UK. So there are two key mechanisms that it's really important to understand. One is at the level of the overall market for the UK. We have a voluntary agreement between the industry and the government, and that voluntary agreement caps the spend, and it caps 100% of the spend. So we have a perfectly predictable amount of spend on branded medicines for a 5-year period. So if the NHS spends more money on medicines beyond the cap, the industry pays back. So there is, to my knowledge, no other area. There's £11 billion spent on branded medicines. There's no other area of public spending that has the same level of predictability and certainty. We've had voluntary agreements of one sort or another since the 1950s. So I think there's a very high trust adult relationship between the industry and the government here. But beyond the market cap, of course, we have NICE. And NICE is a really critical part of the landscape because NICE looks at every individual medicine and looks at the data and tries to establish whether or not the added benefit of an individual medicine is worth the price that is being charged compared to the standard of care. And that is a very appropriate check and balance to make sure that medicines are worth the prices that are being charged.
Okay, thank you very much. Don, I'll come to you in just 1 second, but I wanted to just go to, I think it's Jane Ann Fox who made the point before about who she thinks could do without being treated on the NHS, or certainly not have the same focus of attention. What was your point, Jane?
Well, I think when this COVID nightmare began, we had no idea how it was going to affect the general population. You know, it was like a tsunami or tidal wave coming across Europe, and of course with its origins in Asia, of course. But now that we realize that those who are most vulnerable are people like me, people past 70, people who have underlying health conditions, I have to ask myself, you know, can the economy remain on hold forever to keep people like me alive, or must I take responsibility for keeping myself alive? Now, of course, if I become ill, I would be very happy to be cared for. But I think in terms of the balance between the responsibility of the individual for taking care of himself or herself, maybe that's my American background. Believe me, I would never want to go back there again. It's a nightmare, and I'm, you know, as my family says, it's insane. But nevertheless, I think we do have to take responsibility. How do we live? How do we care for ourselves? And to what extent can we ask the state to extend our lives if that means that their suffering will be imposed on younger people, those who, particularly the disadvantaged younger people. I don't know if that's if you get my point.
Thank you. I absolutely get your point there. Thank you for volunteering yourself to speak. Donna, I mean, we spoke before this conversation, and we did sort of highlight a few things that areas that, for example, have come up, like you said, cataracts was one example. But I think you're interested not in pinpointing the exact thing that we shouldn't treat, but how we get to the point of picking the illnesses or things that we cannot, that we should be not treating. Would you just talk us a bit through that? And thank you for joining us, Donna.
Yeah, I think rather than sort of, I think from the RCN's point of view, it isn't about necessarily getting to a point of not treating, but how do we rationalise healthcare in a collective manner? I mean, we will see that, and that goes to how we prioritise healthcare, really. So I lived through the years when David was chief exec of the NHS, and certainly when we had an NHS plan, we were very clear about the improvements we wanted to make in healthcare. We knew what was killing our populations, and there was a discussion, not just with the scientists, but with the population, about how we could make some improvements in cancer, in healthcare, all sorts of areas. And we've seen those drastic improvements. Certainly when you look at things like lung cancer now, the outcomes are somewhat better. But I guess the question for me is, why are we even asking this question? Because what COVID has demonstrated to me is that it is within the gift of the government to actually improve the health of the nation. Now, this has been a singular disease, but it is within our gift. And certainly, if it depends, and I really take on the point that the last person said, yes, of course, we have that ability to look after ourselves. And perhaps we should be thinking about how we turn healthcare on its heels in terms of, is it really hospital care that should be the most important for us? Or do we look at how we deliver care in a different way? So there are lots of nations that think about healthcare as hospital as the last place that people go to. It's not the first place. And how do we, I know forever since I've been a wee nurse in healthcare, we've been trying to shift the focus where we talk about health in the round, not necessarily health in the acute unit. So I think there's a huge amount of things we can do to deter people necessarily from flooding to the acute units, but certainly we can remove outpatients in one foul swoop. We've demonstrated that through COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And actually, it would be really interesting to just see a show of hands now. I'll come to you, Simon McCreary, in a minute, because I know lots of hands will go up now, which so I'd love to know if there are groups of people here who think that we should be means testing a certain amount of things in the future, whether that's a solution to this. But in the meantime, can I go to Simon while people raise their hand about that? And Donna, I'd love to come back to you on that point in a minute, because I think a lot of people have hugely agreed with what you've said, that we need to look at healthcare in the round. But in the first instance, can I just go to Simon and then ask for a show of hands of who thinks they would like to see some means testing in the future for the NHS? Please raise your hand.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, hi.
Hello. Yeah, I want to make three very quick points, if I may. I'll make them quickly, given where we are. The first is to echo this. I think what was said mostly by Donna. This is not. We're either talking here about healthcare as a whole, the NHS as a whole. We are focusing, understandably, on COVID, but this is not just about that. It's not just about acute care, despite that being what most people think of when they think of health and hospitals. The second is, I don't think that this is the right time to worry about rationing or economic efficiency. I think there's a philosophical and emotional question to be asked here about how we do and don't want to fund things. I think the years of fairly recent significant reduction in healthcare funding has obviously had an impact, as the graph showed earlier on. And the third point I'd make really quickly, and I don't know if I'm alone, but I'm really sickened by the hypocrisy of some people, some political leaders who turned out to applaud the NHS whilst previously applauding refusing to raise wages for the people who work in that sector. And I think the important question now should be to possibly raise it above those who are expert in the field, whose impact and intelligence we will need later, and raise it to a philosophical question of, do we want to fund a better healthcare system? And is something like a hypothecated tax, which many people support, the way forwards in large scale terms, and then look at how we do it once we have that approach?
Okay, thank you very much. I would say the vast majority of the room here are against any sort of means testing. I'm reading comments which say needs testing, not means testing, self means testing, not means testing, and someone else saying that means testing is just another tax on illness. But there are a few hands who have bravely raised them and said that they would that. Can I go to Jeffrey Greenwood and just to hear your point of view?
Unmute. It's Naomi Greenwood, not Jeffrey Greenwood.
Barry Greenwood, you are welcome.
He's just got a better. I'm sorry, I've tried to start my video and it won't.
Oh, okay. Well, we will hear you. And
okay. I wasn't. I'm not for means testing. That wasn't my point. My point was that in the two countries I mentioned, and I'm not exact about how they do it, and in several other countries, that you have to ensure you are means tested in a sense on insurance, so that everybody can get a standard of healthcare in response. If you are able to pay more, you will get it in a better hospital or a more senior doctor, but everybody gets healthcare. They pay differently. They pay according to their means, and the rest is supported by insurance. So a wealthy person will pay much more insurance. Somebody who doesn't have money will be supported by the government fully. That's what I meant, not means testing to pay at point of contact, but means testing right from the beginning. Is that clear?
Absolutely understood. Thank you. Do keep your hand up if you'd like me to go to you. Raise them, put them down if you'd rather not be put on the spot. But I'll go back to Donna just to say, you know, the government has made choices before about what they are happy to fund and not happy to fund. And again, one of the things that Chris touched on at the start was IVF. It used to be that you could have 10 rounds of IVF, and now you can only have 2. That is one of those decisions that has been made about what we can't afford to treat. But what you do see developing is a sort of 2-tier system where people who want to keep going after those 2 can afford it, they can go privately, and then others that can't. Do you worry in the future about a sort of 2-tier system with people going privately and the NHS being for those that can't?
I think I would say as a nurse, and you'd expect me to say this, is that it's not, health isn't something that, you know, it's more important for you to have and not for me. It's not a commodity. But we've always had a private healthcare system alongside the NHS. It's not new to us. And what you can see is sometimes that it just means that the NHS is able to have more capacity. So I'm not anti private healthcare being in existence. It does sometimes take some pressure off if people can afford to and choose to do so. I'm not going to negate that. I think, but it is important that actually it's a universal commodity for the people of our country so that they can access it. So you know, as many of our readers have said, it isn't about necessarily means testing, because what you don't want to be is bargaining, you know, you can have health, but I can't, or that your health is more important than my health. We do want to offer a service, and we've had that, we started with that bit about, you know, okay, we spend 10% of GDP, but what stops us spending 18%? It's a choice. If the health of the nation is of the highest order, then we can spend on it. The second thing is that in that, we have to recognise that we each have a responsibility to care for our own health. And so somehow as a society, we've got to fuel that bit. Having managed A&E, sometimes that is the bit that is missing, is that it's not just about running to a hospital, it is about, and so what can I do for my own health?
Okay, thank you very much. There are a couple of hands up. I hope they're meant to be up. Can I go to Miranda Berry?
Hi, can you hear me?
Hello. We can. Can we see you as well? Yes, we can.
Yes, hi. Hello, everybody. This is a question to all three on the panel, and particularly Donna. I'm really interested in what Donna's been saying. As we're going through COVID, I think what we're having to do is to focus more on healthcare that's been delivered by doctors in general practice, and about social care and about public health. So far tonight, a lot of the conversation has been very much about hospital settings, which is going to be limited because of COVID. You'd already said 30% of the capacity will be restricted because of COVID. And also we've got a shortage of nurses. So whatever resource is available in the NHS, should we be actually thinking more about how we use it more creatively in general practice?
Okay. Should I come, Richard? Can I come to you first about that?
Yeah. So I think that's a really brilliant question. I think there's one link to the comment that was just made by Donna about, do we spend 10% of GDP or 18% of GDP? I mean, we may not go to 18% of GDP, but one obvious thing is, how much more of a percentage of GDP would it take to, pay nurses a decent salary so that we don't have 40,000 vacancies or whatever the number is right now? I mean, bluntly, we can afford to fund that level of minimum care properly, and I think we absolutely should. I think with respect to the role of primary care and social care, I think it's so critical, and there's so much more to do, particularly on the social care front as well, that I certainly don't have the expertise to even scratch the surface of. But what I would say is that there may be, dare I say, an opportunity of a silver lining for a real national conversation about how we think primary care in particular should work as coming out of this crisis. I think there has been, I think all walks of life have done things in new ways. We're having this event on a Zoom call, for example. Of course, we know the story about many patients taking advantage of video calls, which is not right for everybody. But if that takes a significant burden off of part of the kind of care delivery community, then really, there's an opportunity there to, I think creatively about what the nation's expectations are on primary care. What's the role of self-care? I think we've seen many more examples of patients, getting by is probably the wrong word, because of course we want people to more than get by. But if you can be successfully treated with a conversation with a healthcare professional in the pharmacy and an over-the-counter medicine, that immediately takes an amount of burden off of GP surgeries that could potentially be directed to where there is greater need. So I just think, there is an opportunity. We ought to think right across the NHS about where can we use this crisis as a means of accelerating change that we've maybe had to take on out of necessity, but actually could take us into a more sustainable place and ultimately a better place for both staff and patients.
David, I'll come to you because I know this is close to your heart. The way I know you're excited about the innovation potential, and actually, for those nobody who's had any experience with the NHS in the last few weeks, I will just tell the quick story of a friend of mine whose child's tooth came out, and they were worried it was an adult tooth and not a baby tooth, because the child was 13, and they called the dentist, who could then see through their phone a camera, put it into the child's mouth, and the dentist was able to say within 5 minutes, no, it's nothing to worry about. And they were absolutely delighted with that service, because it took, happened immediately, no long queues, no waits, no time off work. And it did, I think this is exactly the kind of point you're making here, which is that there have been the potential to do all of these things, and we've sped up that innovation in a really extraordinary way in the last few weeks. But David, I'd love to hear you talk about this.
Well, I think you've said it really. I mean, it strikes me, for a long time, and our healthcare system is no different to many others, well, you know, I've worked now in about 20 different countries over the last 6 or 7 years, and everyone's basically got the same issues. You know, everyone is trying to deal with people taking more responsibility for their own health and their own healthcare. Wherever you are in the world, people are thinking about how you can do that and how you can create a system that supports that. Everyone's thinking about how you can create a digital offer, which will, in lots of ways, reduce the face-to-face contact in direct physical terms that the NHS has often been built on to something different. So, you know, you're absolutely right. You know, in the patch I work in, 90% of primary care is now delivered either over the phone or over video links or over email, all of those sorts of things that we've been building up for a while, but suddenly it's left. Now, I'm not suggesting in any way it's the perfect answer to everything. It isn't by any stretch of the imagination, but it shows what's potential. We're doing in the hospital, you know, 30,000 outpatients a month digitally as well. So suddenly we've had this real opportunity to make things happen. But just a couple of things. It means nothing unless you work on the whole system. I think Donna and Richard are absolutely right on all of this. This is not just a hospital thing. This is a whole system thing, and everyone around the world is trying to work out ways in which whole systems can work together. You know, there's been, certainly over the 80s and 90s, a rise in the idea that autonomous health organisations competing together is the best way to get innovation and change. Well, actually, people are concluding that really you do need to create systems who work together to enable change to happen and to get the best out of it all. My issue with payments in all of this is that I would describe it as a zombie policy. It keeps coming up and it's useless. It won't work, and it's particularly a problem for us. If you think about as societies get richer, they spend more money on health, irrespective of whether it's a private system, a public system. People just spend more money on health. And if you think the major limiting factor on health in the next 10 years is actually going to be workforce, it's not going to be money, it's going to be workforce. And so that all that happens is the people who can pay most for that workforce will get that workforce, which seems to me as someone focused on.
Would you just explain to me what you mean by that, by workforce?
Well, if you think about in this country,
not having enough staff, do you mean?
Yes, sorry, I'm using a shorthand. Yes, yeah. We're absolutely not got enough staff. There are millions and millions of vacancies across the world. You know, China itself, I think, is short of about 18 million healthcare workers. India, over 2 million. You know, everyone is in the market to get healthcare workers, and that's going to be the limiting factor on what happens. And just I know I've taken a bit, but just to say, Richard made this point, and I think it's a really important one, and which is, there was a time when people used to think health expenditure is a drain on the economy. It's sort of, we take it off the taxpayer, we spend it on healthcare, and it just drains away. Actually, all the evidence now is that, and I particularly, you know, there's lots of work being done at Oxford by people like Stuckler, who show that health expenditure has a massive impact on the economy as a whole. It's a real multiplier, because when you spend money on healthcare staff, they spend it in this country and they boost the economy. So it is perfectly possible to increase health expenditure in this country and boost the economy, and what we'll absolutely need to do. That's why, you know, the life science industries, the pharmaceutical industry in this country could be and the healthcare system could be an engine to really modernise and improve and grow the economy, and we'll all benefit from that.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Donna, but I'm just going to give a heads up that Andy Russell, I'll come to you in a minute. Mary, I think it's Greenwood, I can see you've got your hand up again. Don't know if you mean to, but keep it up if you do. And Miranda, and there's a couple of people in chat who said some interesting things, if they'd be up for it. Nikki Gorb, and I'm scared of pronouncing this wrong, Kenwyn Giles, if you would be willing to talk, please put your hand up. Donna, there was also that question to you.
Okay, so I think it's really important that as a nurse, as a primary care nurse, public health nurse, I was educated and equipped to treat the whole family. There are nurses in primary care that can deliver care and treatment. So I think it's really important that we invest in our healthcare infrastructure. And I think it's the World Bank that says that if you invest in your healthcare infrastructure, you get back, it pays itself back. So I think it's hugely important to invest not just in the infrastructure, but also in the workforce. I think it's foolhardy of us, and we seem not to learn. If you lower the educational standards of your nurse, you lower the outcomes for your own patients. So it's not a question of stopping me emigrating to America, because I can go and top up my course and still emigrate to America and earn $100,000 a year. And actually, the people that pay most for their healthcare workers will get the brightest and the best. So I think it is time for us to stop fooling ourselves that the paltry, pulling back on education, not having proper workforce infrastructures or responsibility for the workforce and having decent supply is a good way to go. Because actually, I would say you get what you invest in. If you invest poorly, you get poor outcome.
Thank you very much. I'll go first to Nikki Gorb, who could tell us about their experience, then to Andy, and then to Kenwyn. Nikki, hello.
Hello, I'm not sure what exactly you'd want me to focus on, because I've been saying so.
Well, I think you work in the NHS yourself, and I think you said you have been doing online therapies for you've been very active in chat. Thank you for your many contributions. Would you just tell us about your experiences over over the last few weeks, and your outlook for the future, and what you're worried about we won't be able to treat?
Well, I work in a very prestigious hospital that has had to stop a lot of its work, and like all the hospitals, we're doing lots of catch up. Lots of our care has gone online. But as a speech therapist, for example, I'm trying to work with a voice disorder or a speech disorder. You can't really process that properly through the whole Zoom experience. So these people are getting suboptimal care. So you're just pushing things down the track, or you're just leading things up, to pile up. Though people are doing their very best to meet.
So you think it's not the same experience?
No, it's not the same experience. And I know now, I've had experience of being in the room with people. And I was saying that actually being in the room, the relationship actually is 25% of the positive outcomes of all care. There was a fantastic Harvard sort of study on this with consultants and doing sort of orthopedic surgery. They showed that it's the relationship that is actually key to the outcomes for people alongside pharmaceutical, surgical, and all the intervention. So if we are covering ourselves up with our masks, which we have to do at the moment, it's very difficult for people, or we're not able to be in the same room with people, it's very difficult for them to recover and get the best treatment. That's just my feeling about the whole online therapy, though it is better than nothing. It is fantastic that we can still reach out, we can still contact families and patients and everybody to sort of help them manage at this time. And that's also very important than mental health, dealing with the crisis. Anyway, I see Donna nodding away, so maybe Donna has something else to say.
Donna?
I was just thinking there's an ethical dilemma. Do you have a system that's clogged up and can't see anybody, or do we do some online services to kind of release it? I'm sitting here in the home of my cousin, who is one of those people that didn't have a great outcome from COVID because her cancer failed to be diagnosed. But if you've got something or nothing, I think there's a way to go where we can use both. Of course, you can't treat in absentia. Sometimes you have to see a patient to be able to deliver care, and speech and language therapy is exactly one of those services that need. But there, for some other things, I myself go into outpatients. Why am I going there? Is it for me or is it for the doctor? I often used to ask myself when I'm rocking up. for yet another appointment where he just looks at me and nods. So I think there are some things we can do differently. And the real important thing is to start looking at the things that we can do well, but differently, using digital or AI. And then there are some things that are sacrosanct for the relationship.
Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Donna. Andy and then Kynwen. Hello, Andy, with your hand.
Yeah.
Hi, Andy.
Yeah.
Thank
Great.
you.
So I work with a Norwegian digital platform that works with public services in Norway and Sweden, and it's relatively young. So I'm in all of these debates around the advantages and disadvantages of tech and the future of it all the time. But one of the things that it's enabled for us in Norway and Sweden has been a better connection, both in all the different teams within a local area, whether it be health or education or social care, and connecting them all up in a safe and secure space. But what that has then enabled us to do when we are then connecting with what I'm broadly going to call service users rather than patients, because we work outside of that space as well. What we've been able to do is connect volunteers people who weren't intending to become volunteers, but have moved from being service users to being able to also see that they can contribute through the technology as well. So they can offer their time and they can offer their expertise a lot. Now, as I said, I'm working in Scandinavia at the moment, and I'm seeing that happen a lot. And what I've seen less of that in the UK. Hopefully we'll see some more of it. But what I have seen is obviously the growth of the mutual aid society, mutual aid groups pop up everywhere for people within safe and secure situations to be able to support with work that local authorities or a volunteering group might do, or any sort of nursing staff might also do. It sort of takes some of the pressure off them. So my question is it's not, I know we're not supposed to ask questions, but my general request is, what do people think about having ways for people to be sort of more engaged, less as just service users of these services, but more not just helping themselves to be healthier, but helping their whole communities to be healthier as well?
Yeah, I think thank you. I think we've touched on that. That's the great point about the sort of holistic attitude to care and self-care. Can I go to Kynwen, and then I can see a couple of hands that have shot up in the last few minutes. Kynwen, am I saying that right?
Yes, yeah, hi. Oh, sorry, I thought I froze. Yeah, so I guess I was just really interested because I think, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think that COVID has forced a lot of innovation through in the system, which has been great. But I think we're not hearing a lot of the voices of patients in this. And the thing that really worries me is that all of those innovations and efficiencies that we could make, if we don't involve patients, they're not going to work properly. If I always tell people, so I run a cancer support charity. I'm the chair of the Patient and Public Voices Forum for the NHS Cancer Program. And I always tell people that, patients can tell you how a system actually works, not how it's supposed to work on paper. And doctors and managers are often very surprised when they find out what their patients' experiences of a system are, because they just know what's supposed to happen. They write the referrals and they don't see actually the 6 months that it takes you to get an appointment, or what happens once you're there, or what your experience is like. So I just think as we're going through this, we really need to pay attention, because a lot of that was thrown out at the beginning of this pandemic. No one asked patients anything because it was like, we're in an emergency situation. But I think, if you look at the shielding guidelines, for example, to me, that's a perfect example of where we missed an opportunity to really engage with the groups that are having to shield, myself included. I have an immune deficiency. The other thing I just wanted to say is, I think at the moment we have been caught in this kind of something versus nothing dichotomy where, yes, a lot of digital intervention it is better than nothing, but is it the best it could be? And so if that's what we're going to do, how can we make it better? Because I think you do miss a lot of the relationship stuff when you do stuff digitally. And it's one thing if you're talking about a GP that you've maybe known for a long time and you have a digital consultation with them. But if you have something new coming up, and all of a sudden you're going in for Parkinson's or diabetes with new people, or even some sort of mental health assistance with somebody that you don't know, it can be really hard to develop those relationships via Zoom or telephone if you don't know them. So I think we need to look at how we can do something, but how we can do it better. And I'll stop there because I could.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your contributions. A couple of hands. I'm going to go to in the last moments, Ian Johnson and then Ben Cropper. Hello, Ian. Can we hear you? Right, now we can hear you, but we can't see you because you put your phone in front of the screen. Now we can see you.
Okay, sorry about that. Some great points tonight. I mean, two words that come to me from this and from the last few months have been innovation and collaboration. But I just wanted to end where David started, actually, because David may not have written it himself, but he was certainly someone behind the NHS Constitution, and I think it's a fantastic. The only constitution we've got in this country, in fact. So just give me 1 minute. The NHS belongs to the people. It's there to improve our health and well-being, supporting us to keep mentally and physically well, to get better when we are ill, and when we cannot fully recover, to stay as well as we can to the end of our lives. It works at the limits of science, bringing the highest levels of human knowledge and skill to save lives and improve health. It touches our lives at times of basic human need, when care and compassion are what matter most. And I think that's a fantastic thing to kind of bear in mind as we work through what we need to do in the next while.
Thank you for reading us that. I actually found that really, I've not actually heard it before. I actually found it really moving, and I would like to have ended on it, but I promised Ben that I would come to him next. So now you have to be equally moving and brilliant, or just say whatever you wanted to say. Hello, Ben.
Hello. I just had.
Oh, hang on. We can hear you. Yeah.
Hello. I just had one point, really. It was about the fact that with the cutbacks in NHS and the financial restraints that it faces purely because of COVID, and even before that, we face a model in the future where we're going to have to rely on regional, if not national, centre of excellences for certain conditions. And I was heavily involved with the patient and public involvement services, as I think Kyle alluded to earlier, for neurology services in my area when the local NHS were faced with an abundance of efficiency savings. And then I felt like all the recommendations that were put forward by service users were disregarded because they were deemed too expensive, or in their words, not efficient enough. But I feel like it's all well and good listening to the voices of service users, but what guarantees do we have going forward that those voices are going to actually be listened to and their wishes upheld? And I just wonder what the panel thought of that.
Oh, okay. Very briefly, David, could you just give us your take on that?
Well, I think those points about patient leadership, patient engagement, patient involvement are well made. If you think, and I do, and this is what's happening in other countries, that to create a sustainable healthcare system, you need patients being engaged, being more involved in the decisions about their own healthcare, being involved in the design of the way in which services operate to make it right, then they have to be part of it. And I agree with you. I've seen lots of, surgeons who got very excited about digital, who want to do everything with it. But when you bring them together with the patients that they're engaged with, you get a very different story. So it's a really important step in the next stage of rebuilding the health service after COVID.
Okay, thank you all, and thank you all for your contributions. I'm sorry I couldn't come to every hand going. It's just my responsibility at the end to try and wrap up what we've talked about and what I think we could take forward here at Tortoise. Just to say that I think Chris was right at the start when he said, you know, everything in the NHS, every choice that's made is a political choice. So of course, it's a choice what to fund and what not to fund. We started with those interesting graphs which showed the NHS already operating at capacity after the impact of austerity. So understandably, people are nervous about what the future holds. David has said that in the past, the best course of action when trying to understand these questions is to muddle through. And I'm sure that there will be an element of that in the future. And I take Richard and other people's points at the start. The question is not what we can't afford not to treat, what we can't afford to treat anymore, but what we can't afford not to treat anymore, given the impact on the economy of letting things like pandemics take over the country. Jane, I liked you volunteering at the start, saying, you know, that you, the baby boomers, should take more responsibility for your own healthcare. And there was a group of people who definitely thought that self-care was part of the solution. Everyone should be taught self-care, I think Miranda said in comments. And Donna, there was vigorous nodding almost every time you spoke. The questions you asked were, how do we rationalise and prioritise healthcare, and the role of primary and social care needs to be strongly looked at in that. What we've seen in this crisis, which is a thing to be celebrated, is a real acceleration of innovation. I think it was David who said that 90% of primary care is now being delivered via phone or video link, and that seems exciting. I think it was Nikki's concern that it's never quite the same, but somewhere in there it feels like there is no answer that everything should be digital or everything shouldn't, or that we should cut out IVF or not treat obesity. It's going to be a question of compromise, of online experiences being better than nothing, and face-to-face where necessary. I think somebody said along the way, probably Donna, it is within the government's ability to improve the health of the nation, and we should respect health in the round, not just health at the acute end of the unit. But one of the key things I will take away is what I think David said, that as society has got richer, people spend more money on healthcare, but there is this sort of global shortage of workforce in the NHS, and millions and millions of vacancies across the world, and that is going to be the limiting factor in the future. And that is one of the things that I think Tortoise will take away and look at after this. I'd like to thank everyone for their contributions, particularly our guests and all of you. There's a lot for our Tortoise to chew over in the future here, and it's such an important subject. I'm sorry we could only have an hour on it, but there's a lot for us to think about and work on. Thank you all. As is traditional in the digital thinking, we can't clap our way out, so we just have to awkwardly wave and say, do join us again, do look in the app for further think-ins and for the journalism that we hope will come out of this in the future. So thank you everyone, and see you soon.